We are live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm Sonali Basak.
And I'm Tim Stenovec. Welcome to Bloomberg Crypto, a look at the people, transactions, and technology shaping the world of decentralized finance.
And Bitcoin rises to $108,000 for the first time as exuberance since Donald Trump's election win continues to drive crypto higher.
Nic Carter calls the positivity around crypto a full and complete vindication for everything he's fought for. We speak to him in just a moment.
And Michael Sonnenshein, you may remember him as the former chief executive officer of Grayscale. He now finds a new home. We're going to give you the details.
All that and more coming up ahead on Bloomberg Crypto. First, though, let's just look at Bitcoin's run since the U.S. election. And I think to call it a run might be a bit of an understatement. Just exploding since early November, up more than 50% since that election. Look at that, 54%, nearly 155% so far this year. In fact, reaching a new record today for the second day in a row, reaching more than $108,000 per Bitcoin. And all this buying has helped drive Bitcoin's market cap to a record high. Now with a market cap of more than $2 trillion, it is by far the crypto with the biggest market cap out there. Ether does come in second place, but it's a pretty distant second. Its market cap still shy of $500 million, Sonali.
And I'm looking at MicroStrategy. I want to look at it since the election because you have seen that rally in Bitcoin and, of course, MicroStrategy the same, 74% higher. You've seen it plateau a little more recently, but there was another bid when you saw that it would be included in the NASDAQ 100 index, and that will start next week. Remember, MicroStrategy is buying even more Bitcoin. For the sixth consecutive Monday, it announced an acquisition. It holds about $45 billion in Bitcoin. A lot of investors don't really know how to play this, Tim. We talked to Robinhood, Stephanie Guild, earlier today. She said actually a lot of retail investors at this point are selling.
Okay, well, watch the flows there. Meanwhile, at last week's Goldman Sachs Financial Services Conference, Sonali spoke with the chairman of Interactive Brokers, Thomas Petterfy, about holding crypto in your portfolio. Check it out.
Anybody who does not have Bitcoin should have some Bitcoin, but not too much. I would recommend that people put maybe their 2 to 3% of their net worth into Bitcoin. And we, for example, will not allow anyone to invest more than 10% of their assets into Bitcoin, because I think that would be very dangerous.
Now, Bloomberg's Claire Ballantyne recently wrote about how Donald Trump's election victory has drawn a cohort of new investors into crypto. She joins us now. And what I think about this that's interesting is that it wasn't necessarily those ETFs. It was Donald Trump winning in office. Why are new investors getting in now, even ones that have been skeptical their whole lives?
Yeah, so what's so interesting about this story is that name a reason people are investing in crypto. It's as varied as that they want a safe haven. They're worried that Trump's policies are going to, cause inflation. And then there are some that say Trump is a big crypto supporter and that's going to help the price of Bitcoin rise. So these people I talked to after all this time have finally decided, okay, I'm going to buy some Bitcoin.
Okay, you also spoke to some financial advisors for this story, and they're saying, fine, make it 100% of your portfolio. Throw it all in there, right?
Yeah, they're really encouraging that. Yeah. No, naturally, they're not really thrilled by this. I think, when I talk to them, their advice is normally keep it a small percentage of your portfolio, have a plan, think about why you want to own it in the first place. Don't just get caught up in the hype. And if you're going to, invest in crypto, maybe stay away from some of the newer coins. Stick with Bitcoin, Ether, that kind of thing.
Claire, we thank you so much for your reporting.
Yeah.
And of course, you could find her story on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg terminal. We are now going to bring in Castle Island Ventures founding partner Nic Carter to talk more about Bitcoin and much, much more. I actually want to start with something we were talking about a little bit earlier, MicroStrategy. Because one big conundrum is why not just buy Bitcoin? Why get it through something that's more levered like MicroStrategy, even if it's going to be joining the NASDAQ 100?
Well, look, what Saylor's done with MicroStrategy has been tremendous, and he's been able to utilize effectively the fixed income markets to, issue debt and acquire Bitcoin, and now achieve a 2x premium on the NAV of the Bitcoin they're holding. The other thing is that there's a lot of investors that still, for whatever reason, can't buy Bitcoin directly, even via an ETF, and MicroStrategy has been the instrument of choice for them. So it's something that people like. I would say buyer beware in terms of being mindful of that premium. Bitcoin could continue to rally, and you could see MicroStrategy sell off and converge to NAV. But he has done an amazing job so far. I'll give him credit for that.
Outside of MicroStrategy, outside of Bitcoin, how do you feel about the prospects for other things like Ethereum? People are talking so much about this rise in Bitcoin, and I'm wondering if you just see as good opportunities anywhere else.
No, I mean, Ethereum has caught a bid here after trailing Bitcoin for a long time. It's the center of stablecoins. It's the place where you go to do DeFi things. It has the most TVL from a DeFi perspective out there. The NFT market is still largely on Ethereum. There's a lot of good things to say about it, and I think it will continue to do well here for the foreseeable.
Hey, Nick, I want to talk a little bit about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. A lot of folks we've been talking to over the last few weeks think it is something that is likely going to happen under the Trump administration. You're not one of those folks. Why do you not see one happening?
It depends what we mean by strategic reserve. If we're talking about a stockpile and just holding the Bitcoin the U.S. government has already seized, unclear how much they have right now. They might be selling off some of those coins. I think we can reasonably expect that to happen. Trump's been clear on that front. If we're talking about Cynthia Lummis's bill buying 1 million Bitcoins over 5 years, acquiring more Bitcoins for the U.S. government, or even potentially moving away from the existing dollar system to a Bitcoin-backed system, I don't think that's likely. I don't see support in Congress for that. Congress would have to authorize that. I don't believe that it would be prudent, frankly, for the U.S. government to signal a move away from the dollar system, move to a commodity standard based on Bitcoin. Any other nation state, it makes sense for them to acquire Bitcoin, and they are, Bhutan, El Salvador, that's fine. The U.S. is the issue of the global reserve currency. We shouldn't do something that would call into question our own solvency. So even though I am a Bitcoiner, and it would certainly benefit me if the U.S. government started buying Bitcoin, I'm also an American, and I don't think it would benefit anyone if we were to shake confidence in global markets by implying that the dollar is at risk.
Well, as we mentioned, Bitcoin rising to a new record for a second day in a row today, hitting $108,000 per Bitcoin. I wonder, Nick, to what extent the optimism that we've seen is about potentially a strategic reserve from the U.S. government, or other optimism with regard to President-elect Donald Trump's policies when he does take office. If we do not see a strategic Bitcoin reserve or the government starting to buy Bitcoin, do you think we're in for a correction?
Yeah, I think that's a risk factor for sure. The hardest thing about being a Bitcoiner is you're in the trade with a lot of delusional people, right? And whether it's the stock to flow theory or now the strategic reserve, which I don't think is likely to happen, I think there is a bit of a risk that these elements are being priced in, and when there's disillusionment, it sells off. All that said, I said before the election, I thought it would hit 100,000 if Trump was elected. It has done that. Trump himself, he sees vindication in market action. I think he told Axios that he wants it to be 150K. You can fact check me if I'm wrong. Trump wants Bitcoin to go up to vindicate his pro-Bitcoin stance. He's a markets-driven guy. The shackles have come off this industry. It's a new era in Washington for the world. So the rally, I think, does have legs. I think it has fundamental soundness to it. But at the same time, we should be cautious of getting overly bullish about things like the reserve.
What is your price target then, Nick, for the end of next year? Because realistically, people have been buying the rumor. He's not at the helm quite yet. He's not able to put those new measures into place. The new regulators don't take charge yet. When they do, does that unlock a new wave?
Certainly, there'll be immense changes in Washington day one. Debanking will end. SAB 121 will end. The biggest banks in the U.S. will be able to custody Bitcoin crypto assets. The SEC will end its hostile posture. All these things are immensely positive for the domestic crypto industry and for Bitcoin. I think you'll see other sovereigns, maybe not the U.S., but other sovereigns come in and start acquiring Bitcoin. In terms of price action, it's hard to say. Bitcoin's an 80 vol asset. Long term, I'm looking for Bitcoin to match the market cap of gold, which would price Bitcoin at $900,000 a coin.
Nick, you mentioned some specific regulations coming down around cryptocurrency, the idea of debanking. And I'm wondering if you see potential risks ahead, if that is indeed the case. I mean, Silvergate no longer around as a result of having too much crypto. I think it's fair to say. These regulations, people would argue, are here for safety. They're here to prevent bank failures or financial institution failures. What happens during the next downturn in crypto if a lot of these financial institutions are now allowed to have more crypto on their balance sheets?
Yeah, I mean, look, Silvergate and Signature is a long story about what happened to them. You know, they weren't really holding a lot of exposure to Bitcoin directly. They were just banking crypto clients, and they died for it. You know, Silvergate survived that run, but then they were told by their regulators that they had to reduce their depository exposure for crypto firms to less than 15%. So that basically killed them off. I'm not advocating for banks to hold Bitcoin in their asset portfolio directly. I'd like them to be able to engage in custody for their clients, and I'd like them to be able to bank, crypto firms. And I think those are risks that banks can opt into. They can, understand that they're banking a high-risk industry. So far, they've been largely prohibited from that ever since the start of 2023, what we call Operation Choke Point 2.0. I think they should be free to choose. And I don't think the regulators should be ring-fencing this industry and saying you can't serve crypto firms at all. I think that's unconstitutional, and that has to end.
All right, Castle Island Ventures founding partner Nic Carter joining us this afternoon from Miami. Nick, always appreciate you taking the time. Do appreciate it. Well, coming up, crypto lending and fundraising rebounding as Trump's win paves the way for more deals. We discuss with venture capitalist Edith Yeung.
And Michael Sonnenshein becomes the COO of Securitize, a leading tokenization platform. We're going to explain that move from Grayscale. And to access all the latest data and news on crypto, check out CRYP Go on the terminal. This is Bloomberg.
We thought there needed to be clear, transparent, fit-for-purpose rules of the road for digital asset companies so that tokens that are on a decentralized functioning blockchain are treated differently. They're not treated as securities, and we put that in law and defined exactly how to do it. We want America to have a growth policy and a fairness and a transparent policy on how to have a digital asset economy here in America that produces growth. We want to add employees here. We don't want this business driven offshore.
Representative French Hill of Arkansas on Bloomberg yesterday. Let's discuss the crypto outlook for the U.S. with a venture capitalist. We got Race Capital co-founder and general partner Edith Yeung, who is up late for us from Hong Kong, and we certainly appreciate that. Edith, good to see you again. I want to start. We'll talk about deals and what's happening in VC and what you're seeing right in just a few minutes. But I want to start with the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve here in the United States. We just spoke to Nic Carter over at Castle Island, who doesn't actually see that happening during the Trump administration. You do. Why?
I think, during the President-elect Trump, during his campaign, he was very, very bullish about Bitcoin. And I think he's one of the person where when he said that he's going to make it happen, it will happen. I think regardless of political viewpoint or whatnot, Bitcoin particularly is such a really big promise during the Trump campaign. I really think, especially now we have a new crypto czar, we have a new SEC chair. It's just there's such a pro Bitcoin, particular pro crypto administration. When they say that they will make it happen, I do believe that it will happen. And more importantly, I think that there are already, based on what I read, about 190,000 Bitcoins is already sort of under siege as part of the government. So in that sense, to build that up is actually not difficult. And it also really set the stage for the rest of the world. I've been sitting in Hong Kong and have a lot of conversation in the past week or so with various different regulators in Hong Kong. I think, frankly, around the world is really waiting for the U.S., especially the U.S. government, the SEC, and the new crypto czar. What exactly are they going to do around Bitcoin? And I think really the world is watching.
the world is watching when it comes to politics, when it comes to policy, and when it comes to, of course, that strategic decision around the Bitcoin reserve. One question I have about any potential for a reserve is Bitcoin is a finite asset. Dollars you can print. And so if you think about that supply-demand dynamic, doesn't that create a significant risk to Bitcoin? I mean, on one hand, it would be beneficial, of course, in the near term, but what is the long term when you're dealing with a finite asset that would be underpinning actual global markets? Especially, by the way, Edith, a lot of people dispute whether you should be using Bitcoin for payments to begin with and whether it should be held as an asset, as a store of value. If that can't be figured out, why should it be? Why should there be a strategic Bitcoin reserve?
Yes, Sonali, I think this is a great comment. And really, like the way that I look at Bitcoin is very, very similar to the digital gold. And gold also is a finite asset. So around the world, and don't get me wrong, just because even the US do end up having a Bitcoin reserve, is still for the rest of the world to catch up. It takes time. So, and I don't think any sort of like Federal Reserve or like in Hong Kong case and Hong Kong Money Authority is going to just like jump in and say we're going to have reserve today. It takes a lot of thoughts and deep thinking around we're going to have a reserve for gold and now Bitcoin, which is the digital gold. How do we control and manage all that? And by the way, the only reason, that's not many reasons why I think the world is going to follow suit of the US. Been studying around this particular company called Boya, publicly listed in Hong Kong. Essentially, they are doing exactly the same strategy as MicroStrategy in the US, except this is a Hong Kong version of it. They hold only about 3,000 Bitcoin or so, but right now it's worth about 300 or 350 $1 million, but their valuation for the companies is only about like 400 million or so, and the stock price increased 10x this year. So there are such a similarity in terms of strategy just around the world in terms of financial ecosystem, where the world is watching how US is sort of structuring all this, but I think everywhere else around the world is going to be at least six months to a year behind. So, but the thinking is, I'm not the financial secretary nor the crypto czar, and so I don't have like a really clear economic strategy. But I think that we should always take President Trump very seriously when he says something in public.
Edith, before we let you go, I promised we'd talk about deals. At Raise Capital, what's exciting to you going into 2025 when it comes to decentralized finance and when it comes to where you plan to put your money?
Yeah, so at Raise Capital, we are very focused on, always been infrastructure focus. I'm early investor in Solana, very, very thankful for that. But at the same time, as much as we very focus on anything sort of L1, L2, less so for DeFi. And so the part that, as much as I'm very optimistic for the overall industry, at the end of the day, what we focus on is really about where the developers goes, right? So this year, really, even though the year end was such an optimistic note, but at the end of the day, it's still only around 23,000 in terms of overall number of developers that is working in the ecosystem. I think where the world is going is Asia, I think, is always going to define on the application usage. So a lot of gaming, a lot of NFT, a lot of DeFi developers. I think US, particularly Silicon Valley, what we're seeing more infrastructure focus. My company's Human Finance, they are more on the PayFi focus, is sitting in Silicon Valley. So it's still, in the grand scheme of things, I'm excited about industry, but in terms of infrastructure developers, it's still not enough. Like 23,000 compared to the millions in the AI space is a dramatic difference. And even though, let's say, for the optimistic environment, we will double, triple, even to 100,000 developers, it's still not enough. So I'm optimistic, but I'm still waiting for more developers to work on the infrastructure space.
Raise Capital co-founder Edith Yeung, we thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to seeing where you put your wagers next. Now coming up, Securitize hires Michael Sonnenshein following his exit from Grayscale. We're going to give you details about that move next. This is Bloomberg. Michael Sonnenshein, former CEO of Grayscale, has been appointed as the first chief operating officer of tokenization platform Securitize. We're going to get the details from Bloomberg's Mike Regan. It's interesting to see this move because Grayscale, of course, was a pioneer in the way really Bitcoin was held. Securitize, on the other hand, has worked with BlackRock. They've been working on kind of making this more mainstream, but not in the world of Bitcoin. It's in tokenization instead.
Yeah, right. It's a pretty interesting hire. You know, as you said, Michael Sonnenshein really led Grayscale through a tremendous period of growth. You know, up to about 44 billion, and it's Bitcoin fund before it converted to an ETF. Then he left in May. They didn't really say a lot about why he left. They just said he left to pursue other interests. I've seen some interviews with him. He hasn't really added much detail to that, but. You know, kind of a surprise at the time, and now
because the ETFs were launching, the spot ETFs.
Yeah, it was just 4 months after the ETFs launched. You know, and he led the unit of DCG through that very contentious legal battle that really is what finally opened the door to all these Bitcoin ETFs. So it was a bit of a surprise, but I think it's definitely an interesting hire for Securitize. I mean, while Bitcoin's been making all the headlines this year, another story that really I think traditional Wall Street has its eye on is this tokenization of real-world assets.
Well, what is that story, and what does Securitize do?
Yeah, so probably the best-known product they're associated with is BlackRock's money market fund. It goes by the ticker BIDL. It's about $500 million in assets right now. So it's not really, groundbreaking growth. Just launched this year, but I think there's a lot of optimism that this type of product is the future, perhaps. One thing that's going on behind the scenes is there's a push to allow the CFTC to allow products like this, tokenized assets, to be used as collateral in derivatives trades. And I think the thinking is that would bring in a much wider audience for them.
Bloomberg's Mike Regan, thanks so much for joining us. Do appreciate that. Don't miss Wednesday. MicroStrategy Executive Chairman Michael Saylor on Bloomberg TV at 10:30 a.m. New York time. And that is going to do it for Bloomberg Crypto for 2024. We're going to see you again in 2025. Happy holidays, everyone. Happy New Year. This is Bloomberg.